Peter Godfrey-Smith, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
It's lovely to see you, also known as the Octopus Man. Your book is absolutely everywhere. It's been in every bookshop that I've been in the last, 7 or 8 years for sure. It's been out for 10 years, did you say?
Just on 10 years, yeah.
Yeah, it seems to do very well, and it's brilliant to see philosophy of mind, consciousness, and it being grounded in empirical research, making the rounds and doing so well in the public reading sphere, for lack of a better phrase. Animal consciousness, then. It's a relatively underexplored issue in philosophy of mind. Would you say that's a fair reflection of the field?
It was for a long time. When I was a student back in the 80s and into the early 90s, it was strange how little there was. And many of the positions that people had staked out now look like quite unmotivated in some ways. Donald Davidson's influence was strong. Other philosophers who thought that the link between language use and the presence of a mind had to be a very tight link, that their influence was strong. So the idea that mind is absent from non-human animals was a pretty mainstream view.
Really?
Yeah, and to some extent that there hadn't been enough disambiguation of exactly what was meant. So, for example, the idea that everything that happens to a non-human animal is unfelt, I mean, that was part of the landscape, very much so. But a lot of people who were concerned with mentality and animal minds might not have quite asked themselves the question, am I saying that for all non-human animals, whatever you do to them is unfelt? Now, since that time, I think it's fair to say, since the early part of this century, there's been much more work. So now I think it's a properly explored area.
Well, one of the most gruesome and upsetting examples that comes to mind is probably René Descartes' mechanistic picture of non-human animals and him sneaking home animals under his coat to go and dissect them in his laboratory. In terms of animal consciousness, taking it seriously, we hear arguments in philosophy of mind about we could never know what it's like to be a bat, or people challenge those who argue for veganism and movements like that how do you really know that these creatures are experiencing things? And I was recently hosting a debate between Alex O'Connor, who you know, and William Lane Craig, the Christian apologist. And William Lane Craig said, it's not the case that non-human animals feel pain, the majority of them, in the same way as we do, because you need this frontal cortex part of the brain which is able to loop back on itself. So you're seeing me now and you see the microphone, but you're only aware of it. I think it's the awareness of awareness thesis, which is, I'm trying to reference here, Brentano's view, that conscious experiences are only those that you're aware of. And so if non-human animals don't have that complexity of the brain, says the argument, then they can't be aware of their pain. What do you think of arguments like that?
I think that family of arguments about the need for a higher level representation, a meta perspective, a perspective on one's own states, I don't think it's well motivated as a general account of consciousness. Here again, I think the history is interesting. When those ideas were first introduced to philosophy, not sure who would get credit for being the first, but David Armstrong would be an example of someone who had an early version of that view. The idea of higher order representation of the agent's own states as part of consciousness. When that was introduced as a theory of consciousness, the word consciousness then referred to something fairly sophisticated, something over and above bare feeling, the most basic kind of feeling. And through the twists and turns of the history of the field, I think by the end of the last century, the word consciousness had been broadened to cover feeling in a more general sense. This idea of higher order or meta-representation, a view of one's own internal states as integral to consciousness, was on the table. And I think somewhat uncritically, it was now taken to be a theory of the broader and more basic phenomenon, feeling itself. And there I think it's quite unmotivated. So perhaps we should talk about octopuses
I'd love
for a
to.
little while.
Why the
octopus pain?
Why the interest in octopuses as well? Why that? There's hundreds of millions of species of animals. You focus on octopuses for your book, Other Minds, which I referenced. So why octopuses in particular?
Well, I'll say something general, but then I want to focus on an experiment that I think bears on this this question, the Craig O'Connor conversation. I mean, octopuses in general are special because they're so far from us in evolutionary terms. They're mollusks, their relatives are oysters and things like that, snails and slugs, but they have very large nervous systems, and they've independently evolved a way of being, a form of life that has all sorts of features that are similar to us. They're inquisitive, they're very visual, they quite like novelty, they're exploratory animals with these big nervous systems. To have an animal with that combination of features where they are in the evolutionary tree, miles and miles and miles from us vertebrates, that's what makes them special as I see it. Now, on the pain thing, when I wrote Other Minds, the experiment I'm about to describe hadn't yet been done. This is a 2020 experiment. It's more recent. And I see it as helpfully pushing against some of the ideas that you were mentioning there. This work was done by Robin Crook in San Francisco. She gives octopuses a not very unpleasant, but somewhat unpleasant, presumably aversive stimulus, which is an injection of acetic acid, which is vinegar in one arm. So it's not going to kill them, it's not going to harm them permanently. It's probably, well, what does it feel like? That's the question. Suppose it feels like a stinging sensation to have this done to you if you're an octopus. Well, what would you do if it did sting? What makes the Crook experiment valuable is the fact that it shows not just a single consequence or response of this, but a kind of a network or a sort of a collection of different responses, which when you put them all together makes sense if there is feeling present. So for example, the octopuses they'll avoid the area in their environment where this happened. They'll tend the wound, they'll protect it, and they'll sort of groom it with their beak and things like that. That wound tending behavior will be eradicated if after the vinegar injection you give them a drug which is it's a topical anesthetic for us. It's an ordinary human anesthetic or analgesic, lidocaine. You give them that and they don't care anymore. And you also give them that and they don't have this new aversive attitude towards the environment where this happened. So there's this network of things, the grooming, the avoidance, the fact that both the grooming and the avoidance are eradicated by applying a drug that plausibly is reducing the sensation. In an experiment like that, what we're seeing is not just one thing, but a kind of collection of consequences of the stimulus that are quite human-like. I mean, if I gave you an acetic acid injection right now, you would probably...
I'd run before you managed to stick me with it. I'm flight, not fight.
But were you to be caught by surprise, I would wager you would avoid the sort of circumstance. You would avoid me in the future. You would avoid the circumstance where this has happened.
Yeah.
You'd probably mess around and groom and try to work out. But if I immediately gave you a drug that eradicated all the sensation, then you wouldn't care. You wouldn't regard. Well, you might regard me as a bit dubious still, but not. It's not the same if it doesn't hurt anymore. So the point of a Crook experiment is there's at least something there in the octopus that has a similar collection of effects to what might happen in the human case.
Yeah.
The idea that it's felt aversively makes sense of all these consequences.
Yeah.
And they have a very different nervous system architecture from us. It looks nothing like a human brain. An octopus brain looks a bit like a donut, because with the esophagus going through the middle, you've got sort of a donut, you've got these two big things behind each of the eyes called the optic lobes. You've got a thing which is, in a human, almost all the important areas are paired, left, right, and this is an unpaired thing called the vertical lobe, which sits in the middle, which is thought to be something of a kind of high-level controller.
Ah, okay.
All the things that motivate these fine distinctions between pathways in the human case and that might motivate a person to say, well, this is, in order for it to be felt aversive in a human case, you have to have this pathway and this kind of looking down on the other part of the processing by this part of the processing. At least as far as I know, there's no analog of that stuff in an octopus. And I don't think you really need to look. I mean, it'd be good to know what's there.
Yeah.
But when you see an experiment like the Crook experiment, the idea that it feels aversive to the animal just seems not proven. None of this stuff is proven. We can't prove the presence of felt experience in pretty much anybody except ourselves. Yeah. But the indicators are quite strong. And those indicators seem to be powerful indicators, whether or not you have a kind of higher order viewing of the processing by a distinct part of the brain or anything like that.
When it comes to consciousness more generally, how far and back, evolutionarily speaking, in your view, do you think it goes?
In the book Other Minds, the bet that I made, which I still think is a reasonable bet, is that if you go back to the Cambrian, so 540 million years ago or so, you have the evolution of behavioral complexity and good senses, navigation, targeted motion in a bunch of different evolutionary lines separately, more or less independently. There's the vertebrate case, there's the case that leads eventually to octopuses, some mollusks, and you have, most importantly around that time, the case of arthropods or arthropod relatives, sort of crustacean-like animals, basically. And it seemed to be reasonable to me to think that around that time in the Cambrian, there was the beginning in several groups of a form of consciousness that was tied to the new kind of regime of behavior that became important. The thing I would modify a little bit, perhaps now, concerns the what was going on before that, the earlier states, and also what's going on in animals now that are less kind of conspicuous in their behavioral complexity.
Less conspicuous?
Animals like slugs, for example, or earthworms. I mean, with an octopus or a parrot, it's sort of obvious there's a lot going on inside. Whether or not you think it's felt, there's just a lot going on inside. With a slug or an earthworm, it's less obvious. And they
because they're just, their behaviors aren't quite as exaggerated or familiar.
Yeah, they do. They haven't got the resources to do that much.
Can't scream.
And they haven't got arms and legs. They're less mobile. They're more constrained in. They're more constrained in what they can do because their lifestyle just makes sense with a more limited range. The revision I'm tempted towards or taking seriously in relation to the picture of the earlier book concerns how we deal with those less conspicuous, those less obvious cases.
How are you tempted to address that? We spoke, as you came into the studio a moment ago, I said the dirty word that is panpsychism, perhaps, and it was almost like I pricked you with an injection, your reaction to...
No, that wasn't acetic acid, that was a favourable stimulus.
That's
lots
good
to talk about.
Well, as you'll know, the argument goes, and I would put it briefly, that people like Galen Strawson and the like have argued, I think this might be in Darwin as well, that in order for evolution by natural selection to form minds such as yours or mine, you need some primitive sort of conscious stuff for it to play with. So it can't just be physical properties as described by physics. You need some, what philosophers would call qualia or experience or rudimentary consciousness in order for it to form the kind of consciousness that we have in our brains, let's say. And one view, panpsychism, says, well, it's not like we become ensouled in some period of history, and physics and the language of the sciences can't capture consciousness. It's the wrong sort of thing. So the most sensible view is to put consciousness at the heart of reality, or have, to put it crudely, a bit of consciousness amongst the physical stuff.
It'd be the most sensible view if one was confident that there's no way of getting it from its absence. There's no way of putting unconscious stuff together in some novel form and getting something that's conscious. And when you put it like that, it does sound quite difficult.
Oh, thank you. I'll take that. I was worried that I hadn't steeled man.
but not impossible. I think that we can, well, there are a couple of things we need to do to sort of make progress on this. One is to attend to the special features of living systems, of metabolically living systems. And with the evolution of life comes a kind of selfhood that doesn't exist outside of life. The active maintenance of a self, of an improbable organization in the face of tendencies towards decay and dissolution of that orderliness that the system has. A living system in this sense has to have and maintain boundaries, but the boundaries have to have a kind of traffic across them. You can't be completely impermeable. You need to get raw materials and energy coming in. So there's a kind of selfhood, a kind of traffic. There's the beginnings of point of view and the cluster of point of view related properties that come on board with life in the metabolic sense, not in the sense seen in viruses, but in the sense seen in cells.
Yeah.
Now, from there, with that cluster, how do you make your way towards an explanation of genuine feeling? And there I think that nervous systems really are special. I think nervous systems are not just another piece of physical stuff, another piece of apparatus. The combination of forms of activity that a nervous system includes are such as to make it natural, I think, that it feels like something to have at least a complex one. And here we get to the other part of what I see as the next steps in making sense of all this. Even an animal with a simple nervous system, in trying to describe it, the idea of a kind of simple yes-no distinction, it is conscious or it isn't. You know, earthworms are either in or they're out. We used to think that honeybees were out, now we think they're in. The in-out language, I think, is going to have to go. There's going to have to be a replacement of that sort of binary category-based treatment with something more gradient or graded. And to say that is not to say that the gradient will go down to atoms, grains of sand, inorganic material. The gradient that we'll have to make sense of is one that involves selfhood, subjectivity, and the basis for feeling in nervous systems. So I'm going quickly, but I think it's natural to sketch this in broad terms. When the panpsychist says there's no way to explain how mind could arise from something other than a form of mind, there's no way to get it from something other than itself, I would say, well, I can tell you a story about at least some parts of that. There's the origins of selfhood, of sensing. There's the way that nervous systems include networked computational forms of interaction and more holistic electrical activity that I think is a plausible basis for feeling. I think this is explainable.
Where would you put plant life on that spectrum, on that range of, removing the boundary of conscious, not conscious?
Yeah.
It seems like they're somewhere on there because they do enjoy some of the things you were speaking about a moment ago: information processing, growth, life.
A kind of selfhood, although a more their own kind of selfhood, because in a plant like an oak tree, it's not integrated in the way that a person's integrated. In some ways, each stem, each branch, each small part has some self-sufficiency, some autonomy. As just seen from the phenomena of cuttings and things like that.
Well, I thought from looking at the wood wide web, they call it, don't they? You connect all the trees connected together in a rainforest or a woodland. So in one sense, it's interesting what you're saying. The branches are independent, self-sufficient, but in another, there's a deep dependence on sharing nutrients from one tree to the other, or trees reacting when other trees are cut down or on fire, and you see behavioral changes in other trees.
I'm going to have to grapple with exactly that as one of the next things I think about, because I think there's probably some exaggeration in those views of forests that have become understandably quite popular. The idea of sharing and cooperation on a vast scale.
Is that rubbish? Is that not?
No, I don't think it's. I would not say rubbish, but I think there's probably some exaggeration. I had a conversation with a botanist a few weeks ago, just trying to press on this, and one thing that she said to me is, a lot of the things that can be interpreted that way might be more appropriately interpreted in terms of, the things that I'm doing for my reasons create opportunities for other organisms. The things that one form of life in a forest is doing, it doesn't do them to be cooperative. It just does them because that's
what it does.
That's what it does.
Yeah.
That's what evolution has sort of built in as a way of living for this thing. And all sorts of niches arise around its way of being, opportunities to behave in ways that are complementary to it. If I'm being attacked as a plant and I release defensive chemicals, which is a kind of information processing, signaling based,
really complex,
self-related phenomenon, you, if you can, would have good reason to sort of eavesdrop on this as another plant and think, oh, okay, he's being attacked. He's not telling me this because he wants to be nice. I'm just eavesdropping on the production of these volatile chemicals which are used as defenses. So I'm going to prepare some defenses.
Yeah.
I'm going to do things that will enable me, if I'm attacked, to respond. Now that's a kind of making use of the opportunities that one organism's behaviors provide. It doesn't give rise to a kind of grand cooperative vision.
Consciousness there, though?
I'm skeptical about plant consciousness.
If you do this thing
in a way that even has that caution about grey area and don't use the yes/no distinction, and that's because I think nervous systems are special. They don't have a nervous system.
Yeah.
There's some electrical activity that looks nervous system like in some plants, but
even with
as a shorthand, I would say no. I think that
really
out.
okay.
Yeah.
So I wonder, even when we're talking about spectrums, when we're thinking of I've got some leaves, and when have I got the pile of leaves? There is a point where it's a gradation when I'm adding leaves to a pile, and then you go, oh, now it seems like we can say this is a pile of leaves.
Yeah.
But there is a point where you go, that's not a pile of leaves, when I've just got one.
Right.
And so you want to put it closer to the one than closer to the pile, perhaps. But
yeah.
That's interesting that you say no there, because there's, like you say, there is information, there is life. I do think there needs to be some sort of primitive stuff for it to play with, and there would be some real rudimentary, real basic conscious stuff there. It doesn't have to be interesting forms of consciousness that you and I enjoy.
Why the last bit? I mean, in order for a system to maintain itself as a living system, perhaps it's true that there has to be some information processing, some minimal cognition. And perhaps it's also true, in fact, I think it is true, that there's a kind of selfhood that comes along with metabolic life.
Yeah.
So we've got selfhood, we've got some
life.
information processing.
Yeah.
Now, we're sort of trying to find ways for the old language to fit around new knowledge and new categories here. But the idea that with minimal cognition automatically comes minimal sentience or minimal consciousness, I think of that as just, we don't yet have a reason to say that. It's not impossible, but we don't have a reason to say it. If you look at an animal with a simple nervous system, even a very simple nervous system, like a coral or an anemone or something like that, where the nervous system, it's doing the thing that nervous systems do, there, I think, the idea of a minimal form of feeling is more motivated. Now, if I say that about a coral, and I resist it in the case of a plant, and someone else we're talking to says, "I'll forget the corals. You have to be at least as capable as an ant or a moth or something to be in this category," I don't think any of us have a lot of basis to resist the views of the other. Especially given that we're expecting the language to bend over new cases and new knowledge in ways that we can't foresee. But I definitely want to resist the idea that in order to make sense of the minimal cognitive capacities seen across all of life, you have to think that minimal consciousness is there as well. That I would definitely want to resist.
That's good. I suppose the motivation I outlined was one of the simplicity of going, there is no part where the consciousness kicks in, or is no part where we have to go, now it's a pile. That if all of the things being equal regarding the metaphysics, that it would be a benefit for the panpsychist or someone to go, it's consciousness all the way down. And the other views have to go, oh, maybe it's here with coral, maybe it's here with plants. And it seems like there's a very parallel debate that goes on, which we're definitely not going to get into, regarding pro-life and pro-choice debates, where you go, well, where is the point? And you teach that to students all day long, and they won't say, here's the point, and it will seem arbitrary. So I was thinking that would be one simpler reason, but leaving that.
I want to press on the simplicity thing for two reasons. And I'll say one thing which is a more controversial part of my general philosophical outlook, and then something which is not so controversial, and they both bear here. The controversial one, I think simplicity arguments are massively overrated.
Why?
Enormously overrated. The idea that if you have two theories that do as well as each other with respect to the data, that the simpler one is more likely to be true. If we had some reason to believe the universe is more likely to be simple than complex, then sure. But we don't have reason to believe that.
It's the fact you need to posit fewer things, so you're more likely to get it right.
Maybe there are more
things. It could be. If you've got the reasons to back them up, then it's fine. So the simpler would mean that I posit, don't multiply entities beyond necessity, says Occam, right? So when we say simpler, we mean don't add more things to the picture. So if you need to introduce an arbitrary, like magic happens here line, that would be less simple than going, well, we don't need to draw magic lines.
If it's really magical, then the reasons we have to resist it go far beyond a simplicity preference. It's just, it doesn't fit in, it doesn't belong. When I argue about simplicity preferences with people, they sometimes say, you have no reason to think there isn't a sort of an elf hiding in the corner, invisible elf or something like that. And it's simpler to believe it's not there. My response is, tell me about this alleged thing. I mean, how would it fit into our picture of how the world works? How does it manage invisibility? How does it manage sentience? What kind of structure does it have? There are reasons to be dismissive of all sorts of crazy ideas in that family that don't involve simplicity. They just involve the sort of ground level implausibility of those views. Okay, I want to hold this, but also want to introduce.
Go on, give me the non-controversial bit as well.
Idea two, the less controversial response. Panpsychist says it's simpler not to have a kind of a jump or something like that.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I think that simplicity arguments are not very good in general is that simplicity is soft. I mean, what counts as simple is very soft, and I think dependent upon a person's interpretation of a situation. If a panpsychist says it's simpler to have a picture of the world in which there's not this jump, the reply is, look, it's simpler to have a picture of the world in which there's not a cluttering up of absolutely everything by mentality which doesn't have any of its normal observable manifestations. I mean, that's non-simple, to think that the world is full of extra minds or mindedness or qualia.
Well, I think
so the idea that there is a simplicity advantage here, I would contest.
Yeah,
but even if there was one, I think simplicity preferences are, in philosophy, they're hugely overrated.
I have to say this. I have to say, just for the purpose of giving the pushback here, that that when they say simplicity, they mean fewer entities, fewer properties of those entities, i.e. fewer kinds of things. So if you have a theory or good reason to believe in physical things, then positing them here, it's no less simple to posit them over there as well. But then if I say, there is this thing here and there's another thing over there which has different properties, there's a different kind of entity, then that would be less simple. So it's the kinds of entities that you
Do you think there's no preference for theories that are simpler with respect to positing just fewer objects, even within the category of objects?
I think it's a different kind of simplicity, yeah. But I think the panpsychist, in regards to that second point you're making,
part of the softness of simplicity preferences, that I think it's kinds of things you might think. David Lewis, somewhere in an amusing phrase, he said, one kind of simplicity preference is that your gross tonnage should be as small as possible. Gross tonnage ontology. And he thought it was, as I recall, he thought that's one kind of simplicity preference. Yeah. I've got less gross tonnage than you. Another person will say, well, no, it's not tonnage. It's kinds of things, kinds of tonnage. What counts as a kind? I mean, when the when Dalton introduced the chemical elements in the beginnings of a modern form of that theory, some people thought it was needlessly complex. You know, we could probably get by with fewer than the dozens of things that he was introducing around that time. Yeah, it would have been simpler to have just sort of four basic principles or something like that. But Dalton said, well, no, I think we're gonna have to have carbon and oxygen and all the rest of them as well.
Well, this was one motivation for like the Parmenidean view, right? That there's not multiplicity. The multiplicity is an illusion. There's just one thing, and it's illusory that we
There's
break
some
it up.
simplicity for you.
Yeah, that's as simple
Don't
as
have to
it
worry
gets.
about adding things to the periodic table. It's just
Yeah.
there's just one
And
thing.
it seems amusing that even the sentence itself seems to have parts and different parts. So every single, even the statement, there are no parts as parts. So it might seem self-refuting. But leaving that stuff aside, because we have got abstract down philosophy of mind and the metaphysics, I want to bring it back to where we started on animal consciousness. In terms of the animal kingdom now, I take it you think the overwhelming majority of the creatures in our world enjoy some basic or complex forms of consciousness. And I want to bring this to not merely their
Depends
consciousness.
how you count, but I don't think that's a crazy view.
Okay.
Especially because most of the creatures are arthropods, and arthropods are in the category of relatively clear cases.
What do you think of our moral responsibilities towards them?
Right.
Big exhale.
Yeah. No, I think the view that's often now referred to as sentientism, the idea that sentience is necessary and sufficient for at least some minimal moral consideration, is a pretty reasonable view.
Ah.
So all those arthropods would not count for nothing. Now, that can seem hard to think about as a basis for policy. I mean, we can't make peace with the mosquitoes. Humanity just can't make peace with mosquitoes. Whereas lots of the animals that we now regard as sentient and are willing to think about treating differently are not animals that we have to be at war with. Some of the arthropods, we're stuck in a somewhat antagonistic relationship with various pests and mosquitoes and ticks and things like that.
It seems like if someone tries to attack me, I do have a right to
Yeah,
self-defense with them. What about the creatures that we actively farm and torture and
Let
mutilate?
me make another comment about those hard cases, the arthropods. I had a conversation with Andrew Barron, who's a scientist who works on bees mostly at Sydney, about this topic. And I said, well, you know, it'd be hard to make peace with the mosquitoes, really. And one thing Andy said, which was very interesting, is that if you look at how our present range of pesticides work, they're probably about as bad as they could possibly be from the point of view of the insect pests, because they go after the nervous system and they sort of scramble the activity in the nervous system, which is probably, you know, if there's feeling there, this form of going after them with a pesticide is probably the most unpleasant from their point of view.
Yeah.
And Andy said, look, we probably are going to have to protect ourselves indefinitely against these animals, but we could put some effort into developing pesticides that just work differently and that weren't probably quite as unpleasant from the point of view of the pest.
It seems good in terms of, we hear crop death arguments against veganism and the like, and I think there are very strong arguments for like proper fencing, propane cannons, sweeping fields before for ploughing, and those things seem to be, or for harvesting, those things seem to be steps in the right direction regarding the ones that are what you might think of like principle of double effecty, non-intentional killings, which obviously should still be minimalized. But what do you think of the, you know, again?
Okay, right. I think factory farming, modern industrialized farming, is an abomination. It's one of the worst things that humans do. The cases of chickens and pigs I think of as the clearest cases, the really the standout cases.
Yeah.
And that's something I think we should just work strenuously towards reforming.
Do you boycott the pigs and the chickens?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm not a vegetarian. I think that there are forms of humane farming of beef that I feel quite fine about.
So
the real best
you keep the
practice.
chickens and pigs, you don't eat them, but just the beef.
Right, basically. Yeah, at home I eat quite a lot of humanely farmed beef. I get some of
What
it
does
from
humanely farmed beef look
there's
like?
a farm not far from where I live where I know the lives. I've talked to the farmer about the lives of these cows, and they just hang out with their friends all day basically.
Mm.
Uh, and they have a bad day at the end, especially because in Australia right now, on-farm slaughter is becoming more and more difficult. So
Yeah.
the trucks are involved at the end, and that's very unfortunate. But what I regard as best practice in the beef case is you have minimal intervention. You don't separate families more than you have to. The animals just hang out. They're not
Yeah.
taken to a feedlot to be grain finished, to use the American expression. And ideally, they would be slaughtered on site. And the upshot of that is an animal has not just a decent life, but an enviable life, I think, from the point of view of non-human animals looking across the history of non-human life. I feel quite fine about that.
Even with the slaughter itself, because we know that the slaughter is going to be very painful for the animals. One in three.
Well, not if it's done properly. I mean, I think the
Well,
practices
in
are
the
often
journal,
now very bad.
you'll be interested to know this that in the Journal of Meat Science, they found that one in three penetrative stun bolts needs to be retaken. One in seven when they're non-penetrative. And so, given the fact that a third of the stun bolts to the head aren't successful, that you have in up 30% in the cases of penetrative. We're talking one in seven when it comes to non-penetrative, and those animals have been carved up alive, and that's from a Journal of Meat Science, straight from the
Okay,
the animal's mouth. So
that
the worry
sounds
is
very bad.
the worry is why
Not
have it at all, right? Because you support this. I'm not trying
yeah,
to. I'm wondering, like,
yeah.
because you said the
So I'm
animals
not.
need to be separated more than they need to, but they don't need to anyway, and they don't need to be
That's I
slaughtered.
think
And all
actually
here,
that's actually not true
can I have
because
one? Can I have one thing
the
to load it? One very brief.
okay, okay,
The argument that, right. So this is the argument that the larger argument, right? That if having blissful life and then painless killing
yeah.
is a good, then that justifies such things as, I like having puppies. I raise these puppies up to a year, and then I bullet to the back of the head. They're dead. It's not painless, but they have blissful lives for a year. But we both agree that would be wrong.
I'm not going to discuss either the human analogy or the companion animal analogy. Now, if we had a longer conversation, we could talk about why I want to sort of handle them one by one. But in relation to the farming case, when you say, the farmer near my place, it doesn't separate them more than strictly necessary, and you say, well, they needn't be separated at all. One has to keep in mind that if not for the practice of humane beef farming that this farmer is engaged in, it's not that these animals would have some pleasant, indefinitely long life. They wouldn't exist. There's no place for them outside of a system
Yeah,
like
my
this.
worry here is that the
So
WWF
I
and
think
the
that's very important that we're talking about a distinction between
Peter, to put it
a
politely, though,
happy life
because the
and
okay,
non-existence. We're
you
not
don't want
talking
to
about
push
a
back.
contrast between a kind of
No, but
a vast
the
sanctuary.
response here. The WWF and the UN have found that 75% of all animal extinction across the board is because of agricultural practices. And you yourself love the animal kingdom. You're interested in it, in
Yeah.
conscious creatures. And we went from being 1% of the global population of biomass
Yeah.
to 99%. And what's happened there is the deforestation, is the dead lands, is
I'm
the
questioning the figures a little bit, but I'm on board with the message. There's a chapter about
it kills
this
other
in
animals,
my
right?
most recent book. So I think the extent of the human domination of the animal kingdom in the form of agriculture, intervention, just our physical presence is not desirable. It's not a good thing. We should have a lighter touch. I think rewilding is an admirable project. I distinguish this from the question of whether humane farming humane farming, which includes the killing of animals, is always a kind of a very bad thing. There, I want to sort of push back, and it's not a defense of factory farming. It's not a defense of the excesses that production line methods of slaughter have. It's not a defense of feedlots and all the rest of it. It's also not a defense of the fact that vast amounts of forest are being cut down in order to sort of graze ever more cattle. Not a defense of any of those things.
It's indefensible.
But I will defend the practice of humane farming various
Let
kinds.
me ask you one very brief question on this. Is that you argued that these cows' lives wouldn't be there to begin with. And we both agree that the agricultural industry drives wildlife extinction. And I wonder, personally or morally, whatever it is, you have the choice between having 100 cows or 100 animals of different species of similar complexity. I think it might be a human end. I'm not sure how to pin it, but I do think there's value in the diversity of species, and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that I'd prefer to have 100 different species of singular entities than 100 cows. Would you agree with that?
I don't think we have to choose. The, I
But
think
if you know, if you thought experiment wise,
the life of a traditionally farmed domesticated animal that's treated well and with respect, it's not a bad life and it's not a bad thing to have in the world. I want the world to be also full of leopards and wolves and giraffes and all the rest of them, 100%. But we don't have to choose between
the
those
reason I
two
was
things.
asking was not merely because we have to make that choice, but and I think there is a choice to be made in terms of animal agriculture and its impact on the environment and the wildlife that's there as well. I think I do think the death is a harm, a bad, something which is something which should be avoided. In the case of the puppies, you don't want to talk about non-human animal companions. And then with the case of the diversity, I think those are two strong motivations for just not engaging with that industry at all, because you can just get all that nutrients from elsewhere. I don't see what the point is. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, yeah, I certainly understand the perspective. I understand, I see the integrity that veganism has, and um, it's not that I think the perspective I have in which the avoidance of cruelty, the avoidance of harmful industrialized farming is paramount, but humane farming is regarded as okay. It's not that I see that as superior to the vegan outlook. I think it's defensible against many others, many other outlooks. And it's true that, I mean, my own body has a role in my thinking here. When I've moved towards veganism in the past, it's been something of a disaster for my health. I'm a high protein person, I think, now, inevitably. And in order to get the amounts of protein that keep me healthy in a vegan manner, I've found it difficult, I have to say. Given that, I think eating oysters, free range eggs, some dairy, though I think dairy is very
We're getting in
problematic.
the weeds here with the
Um,
dairy and the separation, the
yeah,
male chicks
I
being
think,
killed for
yeah,
the
right,
eggs.
right. I mean, I
You,
think that there are defensible non-vegan options.
yeah.
To say defensible is not to say I don't admire vegans, and it's not to say that I regard my package of opinions as superior.
Well, I think I recently learned that, and I didn't know this before recently, that your average serving of same tofu has more protein than your eggs, and that seitan has 2.5 times more protein than a sirloin steak, ounce by ounce or gram by gram, and that with the right dietitian and stuff, that it can be done. I wonder, just a final question on this. Maybe this is a point we can both agree on, because
Yeah.
I know we're short on time here. You say
Look, I
that,
think we probably agree on tons of
yeah, I think
things
so, and
about the
that's we
clear
found
cases, but we don't agree about this sort of last round of
well, I think
discussion.
we agree here on this point. You said I think veganism is admirable, and you think it's good, and but you want to say that the engagement with cattle farming is uh, is defensible. But reading between the lines there, it seems like you want to say that veganism is better still.
I'm not sure about that because, as I said at an earlier stage, I think the kinds of lives that the farmer I know gives his cattle, these are very good non-human lives. These are enviable, not just acceptable lives from the point of view of being a large non-human animal. You're looked after, they just hang out with their friends all day. You have a bad day at the end. Almost all of us have a bad day at the end. It's not as if anyone's not going to face
I'm not gonna get
a
carved
fate
up
of that
alive. Yeah.
kind.
I hope I don't get carved up alive and conscious. That'd
No,
be
but
really
that's
miserable.
not that's not the relevant that's not the relevant thing to invoke here. That will not happen to his animals. There's no way it will
Well,
happen to his animals
again, I did cite the Journal of Meat
because that's
Science one.
you're talking about industrialized production line. Everything has to happen in 20 seconds. We're not talking. even with the regrettable, I think, decline in on-farm slaughter that my friend the farmer is dealing with, nothing like those sort of horrors are intrinsic to a more centralized system. You're talking about the worst, most horrific cases there. And I don't think there's any chance that the animals that I eat that come from his farm have anything like that happen to them.
A conversation to continue, perhaps at a further point. I know you have to run, but Peter Godfrey-Smith, thank you very much.
A pleasure. Enjoyed that.